Picture this. You enter the Lateran Basilica in Rome on a cold January morning of 897 AD. The air is thick with incense. Bishops in golden robes gather in silence, and sunlight pours through the high windows. At first, it looks like a solemn tribunal, another day of church business. But then you see the accused. It is not a man, it is a corpse, seated on a throne. Dressed in papal robes is the dead body of Pope Formosus, who has been in the grave for over 7 months. His blackened skin clings to bone, his fingers curled like claws. Yet he is here, in front of the living, summoned to face judgment. This is not a nightmare. This is history. This is the Cadaver Synod, one of the most grotesque trials ever recorded. The man leading this macabre show is Pope Stephen VI. With fire in his eyes, he points to the corpse and thunders accusations: betrayal, perjury, blasphemy. The irony is unbearable. A living pope screaming at a dead one. But for Stephen, this is not madness. This is politics. This is revenge. Before we descend deeper into this tale of power and obsession, if you enjoy exploring the darkest corners of history, make sure to hit subscribe and join us. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It always amazes me that stories from over 1,000 years ago still bring us together across the world. Because what you're about to hear isn't just another medieval curiosity. It's a story of hatred so consuming it crossed the boundary of death itself. But to understand why Stephen VI would desecrate a grave and put a corpse on trial, we need to step back. The late 9th century was a world of chaos. The empire of Charlemagne had splintered. Viking raiders terrorized the seas. In Italy, noble families fought for scraps of power, while the papacy became their ultimate prize. Whoever controlled the Pope controlled not only the Church, but the politics of Europe itself. And into this storm stepped Pope Formosus, the man whose corpse now sat on trial. Formosus was not a nobody. Born in 816, he rose fast through the church ranks and became Bishop of Porto, one of the most important dioceses near Rome. He was clever, diplomatic, and ambitious, a man who could negotiate with kings and inspire loyalty among ordinary believers. He even traveled as a missionary to Bulgaria, where people admired him so much they begged Rome to make him their archbishop. But in Rome, popularity was dangerous. The papacy in the 9th century was a battlefield of noble families: the Spoletans, the Tusculans, the powerful houses of central Italy. Every pope was either their puppet or their enemy. Formosus, with his charisma and influence, looked far too independent. In 876, his enemies struck. Pope John VIII accused Formosus of plotting against him, of conspiring with foreign rulers, and of aspiring to the papacy itself. The punishment was brutal: excommunication. Imagine what that meant. The man once respected as a holy bishop was branded a traitor to God, stripped of authority, and cast out like a criminal. For years, Formosus lived in disgrace, but politics never stands still. When John VIII died violently, some say poisoned by his own clerics, Formosus's fortunes shifted. A later pope restored him, and slowly he regained influence. Finally, in 891, at the age of 75, he was elected pope himself. For a man once cast into the shadows, it must have felt like vindication. Yet peace was impossible. Europe was split over who should be emperor. On one side was Lambert of Spoleto, a teenage noble backed fiercely by his mother Agiltrude. On the other was Arnulf of Carinthia, king of the East Franks, a hardened warrior with a claim to the imperial crown. Formosus took a gamble. He invited Arnulf to Rome, crowned him emperor, and in doing so made the Spoletans his mortal enemies. It was a fatal choice. Weeks later, Formosus died suddenly in April 896. Some whispered poison, others natural illness. But whatever the cause, his enemies saw opportunity. Lambert and Agiltrude marched back into Rome, placed their ally Stephen VI on the papal throne, and whispered in his ear, Formosus must not just be condemned, he must be erased. And so began the plan that would shock the world, to dig up a pope and put him on trial. In the winter of 897, Rome prepared itself for a spectacle that blurred the line between justice and nightmare. One night, the tomb of Pope Formosus was opened. His body, buried for more than 7 months, was swollen, darkened, and stinking of decay. By torchlight, grave diggers pulled him from the earth, dressed him once more in the robes of the papacy, placed the pallium across his shoulders, set the tiara on his head, and forced the crozier into his stiff hands. This was not a funeral rite, but a grotesque preparation for trial. The corpse was carried into the Lateran Basilica, the sacred heart of Roman Christianity. There, attendants lashed it to a throne, ropes pulling tight to keep the body from collapsing. Witnesses later said the smell of rot filled the chamber, despite the incense burning in hievi, clouds. Candlelight flickered across the dead pope's face, twisting his features into a grotesque grimace as if he scowled at the living. Into this macabre scene strode Pope Stephen VI. To him, this was not madness, but justice, or at least the performance of justice. He believed Formosus had poisoned the papacy, betrayed the church, and dared to defy the mighty house of Spoleto. Now, even in death, the man would be forced to answer. A deacon was appointed as the corpse's defender, though the gesture was cruel. The man barely spoke, trembling under Stephen's gaze, knowing no argument could change what was to come. The accusations rang out in the basilica, Stephen's voice echoing like thunder. Formosus, he declared, had violated sacred law by abandoning his bishopric of Porto to seize the papal throne. He had broken oaths, plotted with kings, and corrupted the church for ambition. His entire election had been invalid, his reign an abomination. Each charge was hurled directly at the lifeless figure, as though Stephen expected the corpse to rise and confess. The bishops who sat in judgment did not dare resist. Some bowed their heads to the floor. Others stared into the distance, unable to meet the sight of the cadaver in its throne. They were trapped, forced to watch a living pope scream accusations at a rotting body, knowing that to object meant ruin. Yet to remain complicit meant blasphemy. When the charges were finished, the outcome was never in doubt. The corpse of Formosus was declared guilty on every count. The sentence was not only spiritual, but theatrical. Pope Stephen ordered that the papacy of Formosus be erased as though it had never existed. Every decree he signed, every appointment he made, every blessing he had given was retroactively void. Imagine the chaos. Bishops he had ordained suddenly stripped of legitimacy. Marriages he had blessed now considered invalid. The very fabric of church authority unraveling at the whim of a man shouting at a corpse. But Stephen's fury demanded more than words. Before the eyes of the assembly, the dead pope was stripped of his sacred robes, the pallium torn away, the staff ripped from his hand, the ring of the fisherman yanked from his stiff finger. What had been the attire of the vicar of Christ was pulled off piece by piece until the body was left in rags like a common criminal. Then came the final act of humiliation. The 3 fingers of the right hand, the fingers once raised to bless the faithful, were hacked off. The symbolism was unmistakable. Even in death, Formosus was denied the power to bless, as if his very memory was being mutilated. The degradation did not end inside the basilica. The body was dragged from its throne and hauled through the streets of Rome, a twisted parody of a funeral procession. Some accounts say it was thrown into a shallow grave, others that it was hurled directly into the waters of the Tiber. Citizens who watched the sight recoiled in disgust. Even those who despised Formosus whispered that Stephen had gone too far. There were rumors that storms broke out after the corpse was cast into the river, that the heavens themselves had protested, that divine wrath was on its way. For Stephen, the trial had been a victory, a message to his enemies that no one who opposed him would be safe, not even in the grave. But in reality, the Cadaver Synod had sown terror, confusion, and revulsion throughout Rome. The people began to murmur that a pope who screamed at corpses could not himself be the true shepherd of the church. The grotesque trial was meant to destroy the memory of Formosus, but instead it destroyed Stephen VI. Word of the Cadaver Synod spread through Rome like wildfire. Ordinary citizens, already weary of corruption and violence, were horrified. They had seen popes poisoned, strangled, exiled, but never had they seen a man desecrate the body of his own predecessor. Whispers turned to open anger. People said the trial had brought a curse upon the city, that storms and floods were punishment from God. To them, the corpse in the Tiber was not just a humiliated pope. It was a sign that Rome itself had been defiled. The clergy too began to panic. Bishops who had been ordained by Formosus feared for their legitimacy. Priests wondered whether sacraments they performed were still valid, and the fragile order of the church threatened to collapse. Instead of strengthening his grip, Stephen had ignited chaos. Every step he took, every attempt to justify himself, only deepened the impression that he had lost his mind. By the summer of 897, the city boiled with rage. Crowds gathered in the streets, chanting against the pope. Noble families who once supported him now backed away, sensing his fall was near. Finally, the fury exploded into open revolt. An uprising broke out in Rome. Citizens stormed the papal palace, and Stephen VI was dragged from his seat of power. He was thrown into prison, stripped of his authority, abandoned by the very allies who had once pushed him to condemn Formosus. There, behind the walls of his cell, the pope who had screamed accusations at a corpse met his own grim fate. In August 897, Stephen VI was strangled to death by unknown hands, almost certainly assassins sent by his political enemies. The man who had desecrated a dead pope now lay in an unmarked grave, his reign remembered not for triumphs or reforms, but for madness and blasphemy. The death of Stephen VI did not end the nightmare. Instead, it revealed just how unstable the papacy had become. In the years that followed, Rome was torn apart by factions, each pope reversing or reinforcing the verdict against Formosus, depending on which noble family held the upper hand. One moment, Formosus was a condemned traitor. The next, he was restored as a legitimate pope, then condemned again. The papal throne became less a spiritual office than a prize in a brutal tug-of-war. After Stephen's fall, his immediate successor quickly annulled the Cadaver Synod, declaring that Formosus had been a true pope after all. His body, recovered from the river according to legend, was placed back into a tomb with honor. The people cheered, believing that justice, however twisted, had finally been undone. Yet stability did not last. Within a few years, another faction seized power, and the decrees of Formosus were once more questioned. In some cases, bishops ordained by him were forced to undergo reordination, as if their first calling had been erased. Confusion spread from Rome across Europe, shaking the faith of ordinary believers who looked to the papacy as the steady hand of God. The spectacle of the Cadaver Synod lingered like a stain that could not be washed away. It revealed that the papacy, the highest seat of Western Christendom, was at the mercy of vendettas and feuds no less savage than those of warlords. For the people of Rome, it was not just political chaos, but a spiritual crisis. If popes could dig up one another's corpses and shout accusations at the dead, what did that say about the sanctity of the office itself? What did that mean for the authority of the Church? Even centuries later, chroniclers could hardly believe the story they recorded. Some softened the details, others exaggerated them, but all agreed that the Cadaver Synod stood as a warning. The struggle for power had gone so far that the dead were no longer safe from the living. The Cadaver Synod has echoed across more than 1,000 years, not only because of its grotesque imagery, but because of what it revealed about power without restraint. The sight of a pope screaming accusations at a corpse was more than a dark curiosity. It was a symbol of the complete breakdown of authority. It showed how hatred, when given the backing of armies and noble families, could turn sacred rituals into theater, and the Church itself into a stage for madness. For the people of medieval Rome, it was a trauma. Imagine kneeling in the same basilica where generations had prayed, only to remember that a decaying body had once been tied to the throne and put on trial. Imagine wondering whether the sacraments you received as a child were valid, or whether the Pope who blessed your marriage had been stripped from history. Faith, already fragile in an age of famine, war, and disease, was shaken even further. And yet, the story of the Cadaver Synod is not just about one mad pope. It is about the dangers of absolute power and of institutions twisted by politics. Formosus may have been ambitious, Stephen may have been vengeful, but the true monster was the system itself. A papacy captured by feuding families, where hatred could reach so deep that even the dead were dragged back into the fight. In the centuries that followed, reformers would point back to the Synod as proof of how far the papacy had fallen, a warning that divine authority could be corrupted when human obsession and revenge took the throne. Even today, historians see in this grotesque trial a mirror of timeless truths, that ambition can consume reason, that vengeance can outlive the grave, and that without restraint, power will not stop at desecrating the living. It will desecrate the dead. The corpse of Formosus, once thrown into the Tiber, now rests in St. Peter's Basilica, restored to honor. But the shadow of his trial lingers as one of the most chilling reminders of what happens when hatred takes the shape of law and justice becomes theater. It remains a story that feels less like history and more like a cautionary legend whispered through the ages. Beware the madness of men who believe themselves above both life and death. After the death of Stephen VI, Rome did not return to peace. On the contrary, the Cadaver Synod had left such a deep scar that every new pope was forced to confront its legacy. Each successor had to decide, should Formosus remain condemned, or should his honor be restored? And with each reversal, the wound was reopened. The immediate successors of Stephen tried to distance themselves from his madness. One of the first acts of the new pope was to annul the Cadaver Synod and proclaim that Formosus had been a true and legitimate pontiff. His body, which legend says had floated back to shore after being cast into the Tiber, was retrieved and reburied in the basilica with honor. The people celebrated, convinced that divine justice had finally been done. But the joy was short-lived. Rome was still ruled by factions, and when another group seized influence, the controversy was dragged back into the open. Some popes once again questioned Formosus's legitimacy, reintroducing doubts about his ordinations and decrees. In some cases, bishops he had ordained were forced to undergo reordination, as if their first calling had never happened. The effect on ordinary believers was catastrophic. Was their baptism valid? Was their marriage holy? Could their priest still absolve their sins? The very foundations of spiritual life seemed unstable, shifting with each change of power. Imagine the confusion. A man married under the blessing of a bishop suddenly being told his union was invalid because that bishop's authority had been erased. A priest who had served for years suddenly being informed that his ordination no longer counted. Faith, already fragile in an age of famine, violence, and plague, was shaken to the core. As the decades passed, the story of Formosus began to take on the weight of legend. For many in Rome, he was no longer just a pope who had been humiliated, but a victim of injustice, almost a martyr. The image of his corpse floating back from the Tiber was retold again and again, framed as a miracle. Some swore that the river itself had rejected the body because it was holy. Others claimed they had seen light surrounding it as it drifted to shore. In an age when relics and signs carried immense meaning, these tales transformed the dead pope into a figure of quiet sanctity. Pilgrims came to pray at his tomb, believing he could intercede on their behalf precisely because he had suffered so greatly. Priests whispered that healings and small wonders were reported at the site of his reburial. Whether true or not, these stories mattered. They reshaped public memory. Meanwhile, Stephen VI became the embodiment of tyranny and madness. Chroniclers wrote of his trial as though it were an omen of divine wrath. Some said his strangling in prison was God's punishment. Others claimed demons had haunted him until his last breath. The contrast was stark. One pope remembered with reverence despite his flaws, the other condemned as a villain whose rage had broken the natural order. Even beyond Rome, the Cadaver Synod became infamous. Foreign courts mocked the papacy for its grotesque spectacle, questioning how the seat of Christendom could descend into such chaos. Enemies of the Church seized on the story to claim that the institution itself was corrupt to its core. The authority of the papacy, already fragile, suffered a wound that would take generations to heal. For ordinary believers, however, the legends of Formosus softened the trauma. To imagine him as a martyr, a pope vindicated by God after humiliation, was a way to reclaim meaning from chaos. The story turned from horror into a cautionary miracle, a sign that injustice could not last forever, and that even a corpse could triumph over the living when truth was on its side. The Cadaver Synod has remained one of the most chilling episodes in history, not simply because of its grotesque spectacle, but because of what it revealed about power when stripped of restraint. The image of Pope Stephen screaming accusations at a corpse still resonates across the centuries as a symbol of hatred carried beyond the grave. It showed that ambition, fear, and vengeance could twist even the holiest of offices into something unrecognizable. For the people of medieval Rome, the memory was seared into their faith. Every time they stepped into the Lateran Basilica, they remembered the day a rotting body was tied to a throne and judged as though it were alive. Every blessing they received, every sacrament they participated in, carried the shadow of doubt. Was it valid, or would the next pope erase it? The Cadaver Synod shattered trust in the papacy, and trust once broken is not easily restored. For historians, the trial is more than a curiosity. It is a reminder of how fragile institutions can become when consumed by factionalism and vendetta. The papacy, meant to represent unity, became a pawn of noble families, a weapon in their endless feuds. In that moment, the Church revealed not divine order, but human obsession at its worst. And yet, out of this nightmare came a lesson that echoed for centuries. The horror of the Synod became a rallying cry for reformers, a warning to later generations of clerics and kings about what happens when political hatred overpowers spiritual duty. It forced the Church, eventually, to reckon with the corruption that had made such madness possible. Today, more than 1,000 years later, the Cadaver Synod is remembered as both tragedy and farce, an almost surreal story that feels too absurd to be real. But it was real, and its meaning is clear. Power without limits devours itself. Hatred, when elevated to law, becomes madness. And justice, when corrupted by politics, can turn sacred ritual into theater. The body of Formosus lies once again in St. Peter's Basilica, honored like the other popes. Stephen VI, his accuser, is a footnote remembered only for his insanity. That contrast is itself a moral. The rage of one man lasted only months, but the dignity stolen from the dead was eventually restored. What remains is a cautionary tale, whispered through time. Beware the rulers who believe themselves greater than life and death, for they will drag the living and the dead alike into their madness.